Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello and welcome to Brave New World. A question I sometimes ask myself is whether our existing laws are adequate in the age of social media. Who should we trust as gatekeepers of social media platforms? How should they be regulated such that we protect freedom of speech and the democratic process? A number of cases against the major social media platforms are currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. The outcomes will have a major impact on the future of social media platforms. Joining me today is Jameel Jaffer, who is the Executive Director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Jameel's work covers free speech, privacy, technology, national security, and international human rights. Jameel, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
So before we get started, just, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into law? What influenced you growing up? Just stuff like that.
All right. So I am the director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, and we work on protecting the freedoms of speech and the press in the digital age. And I've been at the Knight Institute since it was created, which was almost 7 years ago now. I was the first person hired to build the Institute, and now we are almost 30 people. Half of us are litigators, and we litigate cases relating to free speech in the digital age. And then we also have a very active research program now. We just held a conference a few days ago on algorithmic amplification. And our previous big research initiative was on the regulation of lies, so the question of misinformation. And before I came to the Knight Institute, I was a lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union for 14 years, initially litigating cases relating to national security and human rights. And then later on in my career there, I was overseeing the national ACLU's work on national security, but also free speech and privacy and international human rights. So that's basically my career.
Cool. So, before we launch into the agenda for the day, I'm just curious about this workshop you mentioned on algorithmic amplification.
Yeah.
It's something I've been very interested in and I've actually written about myself. Tell us what that was about and what you came away with at the end of it.
Yeah, so it's this is a research initiative that's a collaboration. So the way we work at the Knight Institute is we bring in visiting scholars from all over the place to collaborate with us on these research initiatives. And most of our visiting scholars have been from the world of the law. So we had some prominent legal scholars, David Posen and Jamal Green, Amy Kapczynski from Yale, have all been visiting scholars with us. But we've also had some people with more engineering or computer science backgrounds. And right now, one of our visiting scholars is Arvind Narayanan, who is a professor at Princeton. The project that we put together with him is, again, one that focused on this issue of algorithmic amplification, which is really about how recommendation algorithms are shaping public discourse online and more broadly shaping society. And one question we tried to ask through this initiative is, what really do we mean when we talk about recommendation engines or algorithmic amplification? Because these are phrases that are used sometimes, very quickly without a lot of reflection. And when we talk about amplification in relation to what? What's the baseline here? So we tackled those kinds of questions, and then also questions about possible regulatory or other interventions that might either help us collectively mitigate the costs of algorithmic amplification or let us better capture the benefits of algorithmic amplification. So that was the idea, and we had I don't know exactly how many, maybe 16 scholars from a broad array of disciplines, including computer science, engineering, sociology, political theory, law, media studies, tackle these questions through papers, and then at this symposium as well. And we'll be publishing the papers now over the next few months.
Very interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to this question during our conversation. It's also a striking coincidence that you mentioned Jamal Green, because, as we sit here and talk, my computer is actually resting on his book.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's like, and I can see it, how rights went
How
wrong.
rights went wrong. Yeah.
So
It's
like,
actually right here behind my computer too.
yeah. So I'm actually looking at it, as we speak.
It's a good book. It's a good book. He did a project for us called "The Future of Free Speech," and we commissioned a set of essays about digital age threats to free speech. But he's an extremely talented scholar. Was a pleasure to work with, and is now working for the Biden administration. So hopefully doing some good in the world.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Small world. Let's start, Jameel, with a really broad question, and this has to do with the Supreme Court, which is going to hear a series of cases over the next couple of years relating to free speech on social media. So, how significant are these cases, and what's at stake in them?
Well, I think the short answer is that these are hugely significant cases. So there was this, I think, many people who aren't immersed on a daily basis in issues relating to the First Amendment don't realize that the First Amendment as we know it is actually very young. It wasn't until early in the 20th century that the First Amendment was given content or given meaning by the Supreme Court. It was in these cases that Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis were writing initially in dissent, and then in concurrences, and then eventually in majority opinions. They set out this theory of the First Amendment, and as a shorthand, we sometimes refer to Holmes's theory as the marketplace of ideas theory. But it wasn't until 1919 and arguably almost a decade after that, that the Supreme Court really started giving content to the First Amendment. And then the First Amendment as we know it today was really written in the 1960s. It wasn't until Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is the case that holds that the government can't punish you for mere advocacy unless your advocacy amounts to incitement of imminent unlawful activity. So that was one crucial case. Another one was the Pentagon Papers case, which is 1971. Maybe a third crucial case is New York Times versus Sullivan, which is a case that holds that public officials can't recover for libel unless they can prove that the false statements were said with actual malice. Like, these are the cases that really define the First Amendment, and they weren't written until the 1960s.
So hang on a second, if I may clarify,
Yeah.
right? Because the First Amendment goes way back, and in preparation for this talk, I started reading the Federalist Papers and just sort of what the whole
Yeah.
I sort of went way back, and it's very interesting because you can see the original statement, which was actually amended several times before it became the First Amendment. So just go back a little bit here and just remind us what the original one was. And when you say it was rewritten, do you mean it was reinterpreted or like literally rewritten?
I don't mean literally rewritten. No, I just mean that, so the First Amendment has this, relatively categorical language: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, etc. But that language becomes part of the Constitution in 1791, and then in just a few years later, you have the Sedition Acts, in which people are being thrown in prison for criticizing the government, and somehow the First Amendment coexists with this practice of throwing dissenters in prison for their political beliefs and their political expressions. And powerful people in the United States came to regret that particular episode, and eventually Congress paid back the fines that had been levied on people who had violated the Sedition Act. The people who had been convicted under the act were given pardons. But at essentially at the same time as the founders were saying, we value the freedoms of speech and the press, people were being thrown in prison for their views. And there were all sorts of restrictions on speech that were imposed and enforced between the time the First Amendment was adopted and the early 20th century, with nobody suggesting that there was a constitutional problem with those, with those laws. And again, it wasn't until just after the First World War, when people were being prosecuted when these prosecutions for Espionage Act prosecutions were going up to the Supreme Court, it was only then that the Supreme Court started to say, well, maybe there's a First Amendment problem with with the enforcement of some of these laws. And the case in which Holmes references, he doesn't actually use this phrase, marketplace of ideas. He uses a slightly different formulation, but now we refer to it as the marketplace of ideas opinion. That case was an Espionage Act prosecution. There were, accused. The accused in those cases had made some anti-war leaflets and had been distributing those anti-war leaflets, and they were eventually prosecuted for undermining the war effort. And Holmes, in this dissent from the Supreme Court's affirmance of their convictions, Holmes says, come on, guys, how can we reconcile this kind of conviction with the First Amendment? And that was really the birth of the First Amendment. But I didn't actually even get to my answer to your question, because you asked me a question about these cases. No, my fault. But the only reason I brought up that history is because when there was this period in the 1960s where the Supreme Court, and early 1970s, where the Supreme Court really gave us the First Amendment as we know it today. And I feel like we might be on the verge of getting a kind of similar, very, very generative period from the Supreme Court, a series of really generative cases that end up defining the First Amendment in this information age or digital age or whatever you want to call it. Because you've got these cases, so the cases that the Supreme Court has already heard, there are two of them. They involve the circumstances in which social media platforms can be held liable for terrorism-related content, and these are cases really about the meaning of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But those are important free speech cases because. Partly because this concept of terrorism-related content is actually, incoherent once you start thinking about it, and partly because if you accept that the immunity that platforms normally get under Section 230 disappears when platforms are recommending content, then it's not clear how much there's left to Section 230, because virtually, every social media company and every search engine is heavily reliant on recommendation algorithms. Search engines really are just recommendation algorithms. They're just, you enter a term and then the search engine is recommending content to you on the basis of, your search. And if the responses from the search engine were random, the search engine wouldn't be very helpful to you. So the 230 cases, I think, are really important in themselves. But then the court has also just taken two cases involving the circumstances in which public officials' social media accounts are subject to the First Amendment. And I have a particular interest in these cases because it was my institute, the Knight Institute, that brought the first major case challenging a public official's suppression of dissenter speech on his social media account. That was President Trump. We sued President Trump on behalf of a handful of people who had been blocked by President Trump after they had criticized his policies. And we won that case, in the district court in the Second Circuit. But then it got mooted because Americans voted for Biden rather than Trump, and so Trump was no longer president. But now the Supreme Court has taken two other cases that raise this question of whether public officials' social media accounts are public forums within the meaning of the First Amendment. So those are important cases. And then finally, there are two cases that I think everybody expects the Supreme Court will take next term, which involve the constitutionality of social media laws out of Florida and Texas. My answer to your question has already been so long that I don't want to go into detail on these. We can come back to it. But those cases too are hugely important. And if you take all these cases together, there really does seem to be a moment where the Supreme Court is, confronting a whole slew of foundational questions about the meaning of the First Amendment in this very new, factual and technical environment.
Yeah, there was a lot in there, Jameel. So thanks for that, right? So let's sort of unpeel this, right? So, and maybe a good place to start is sort of what the intention of the First Amendment was, almost more than 200 years ago, and what relevance that it could have. What relevance does it have to the current situation? You've touched on it, but let's go a little deeper into that, because I can imagine the original intent was people on the street, expressing themselves, or writing in the media, or writing in newspapers. I mean, I'm guessing that was kind of the, was in people's minds, that was the context in which they were talking about free speech. And here we are, with the internet, and, you talked about amplification, with this potential for huge amplification, huge influence. So let's just consider that question. Like, how should we be interpreting the First Amendment in today's environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one theory is that the people who drafted the First Amendment were most concerned about prior restraints on the press. And, prior restraint is an order that prevents the press from, publishing content in advance of a judicial finding that the content is unlawful. But the First Amendment has, First Amendment doctrine has left that very narrow conception of the First Amendment far behind. The First Amendment, as we know it today, is much, much broader than that. And the First Amendment is also much, much broader than the text of the statute, because, the text of the amendment. I mean, the First Amendment is addressed to Congress, right? It says Congress shall make no law. There's really no dispute anymore that the First Amendment binds not just Congress, but executive officials as well, binds not just federal actors, but state actors as well through the 14th Amendment. But, so the First Amendment has been given, a great deal of meaning that, many people would, I think, quite fairly say, you can't find that meaning in the text of the statute, and that's true even in other respects too. So, for example, the concept of speech, right? So the phrase in the First Amendment is "Congress shall make no law, ... abridging the freedom of speech." But what counts as speech? And I think many of the things that the Supreme Court has said count as speech seem far removed from the text of the statute. I don't think that's, to say that is not to condemn the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. I think that our society could not function if we interpreted the First Amendment, if we were kind of myopically faithful to the text of the First Amendment. I think our modern democracy would probably fall apart. But that said, there are these, really hard questions about how broad should this concept of speech be? Should it, encompass, for example, campaign donations? Should it encompass commercial advertising? Should it encompass computer code? Right? Like, these are all hard questions that the text doesn't answer. Over the last 200 plus years, many people much more intelligent than me have tried to make sense out of the First Amendment by attributing a purpose to it. That's sort of what Holmes was doing in the Abrams case. He was saying, the function that the First Amendment is meant to serve is to help us collectively find truth, to arrive at truth. And there's no better way to ensure that we arrive at truth than to protect the free exchange of ideas. That was, Holmes's theory in a nutshell. But then Brandeis, only 8 years later, I think, writes this, very powerful opinion in a case called Whitney versus California, in which he suggests that the part of the purpose of the First Amendment is to help us cultivate a citizenry that is capable of participating in the work of self-government. So it's not just that we're protecting a process, the free exchange of ideas, we're also ensuring that citizens are capable of governing themselves. And then many others, since Holmes and Brandeis have suggested that the First Amendment is actually about, or also about, other values, including accountability. I co-taught a class with Professor Vince Blasi at Columbia Law School, and Vince Blasi is a kind of legendary First Amendment scholar, and wrote an extremely influential law review article, 4 decades ago or 5 decades ago, proposing that the First Amendment is at least in part about the checking value, ensuring that powerful government officials and government actors can be held accountable for their decisions. And then others have suggested that the First Amendment is also about autonomy, so protecting individual autonomy. So there are a lot of different theories. I would say that the leading theory is the theory that the First Amendment is about self-government. It's about protecting the democratic process. And a lot of the Supreme Court opinions that I think are rightly celebrated today articulate that view in one way or another. New York Times versus Sullivan, which has been all over the news recently because of, among other things, the Dominion case against Fox. Justice Brennan wrote a really beautiful opinion in that case, connecting the First Amendment to the value of self-government and democracy. So that I would say that's the leading theory.
There's a bunch of things you brought up that are really sort of pertinent to the next question I'm going to ask. So, what you brought up is the importance of a well-informed citizenry that's sort of capable of self-governance, right? So, I guess the original idea was that the main actors in this were government, citizenry, a free press, right? That made it all work. But yet now we have like a fourth actor here, which seems to be the most powerful, which is social media platforms that really hadn't been envisioned, at the time that these laws were drafted. And so I guess my question is, are we worried about the wrong thing, right? It almost seems to me that the citizenry and the government should be working in concert to check the power of this new set of actors, namely the social media platforms that have, arisen.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are kind of perils on two sides. So on, one danger here, let's say we're concerned about, just to make this more concrete, the misinformation online, okay, the proliferation of misinformation online. So one possible way of responding to that danger is to invest the government with the power to suppress misinformation. And the government can decide what's true and what's false, and the government is going to take down the stuff that's false and protect us from misinformation that way. And I think it probably doesn't require any long explanation here. Most people understand that there's some risks associated with giving the government that kind of power. You can look all over the world today and see governments citing the danger of misinformation as a justification for suppressing speech that is actually socially useful and just inconvenient to those governments. And obviously, government actors don't have any special ability to decide what's true and what's false. So there are reasons why we haven't gone down that road for the most part before. We have, in the United States, we have not given government actors the power to decide what's true and what's false and to suppress speech on that, on that basis. So that one doesn't work. So here's another possibility. Let's ask Mark Zuckerberg to decide what's true and what's false, and tell him, you need to police your platform better so that we are not exposed to misinformation about the election and misinformation about public health. It's terrible for our democracy that people think that one person won the election when in fact it was another person who won it. terrible for our democracy that people are organizing around extreme political views. And you, Mark Zuckerberg, or you, Elon Musk, you guys need to better police these platforms so that ordinary users are not seeing this kind of misinformation. Now, that solution too has some downsides.
By the
One is
way,
that
but by the way, on that, they would probably say, "Hey, that's what we're doing, right?" They'd probably say, "Look, we're doing that, right? We're
I
doing
think
our best."
depends on what day you catch them, but they have certainly said that in the past. Yes, and I think that this is an overgeneralization, but for the most part, you see people on the left asking the platforms to moderate more aggressively, and people on the right telling the platforms you're moderating too aggressively, and the result is that conservative viewpoints are being suppressed unfairly, right? But the point I wanted to make is just that investing the platforms with this kind of power comes with its own set of risks, which is you give a very small number of people who are not democratically accountable in any way the responsibility of policing the outer limits of public discourse. And now suddenly Facebook gets to decide, which ideas are permissible in the public sphere, which ideas, even more significant than that, which ideas get traction, right? Because there's a lot of attention to content moderation decisions, which are kind of, sometimes thought of as on-off, like is Alex Jones on the platform or not? But the more consequential decisions that Facebook and other social media platforms make are not about on-off content moderation. They are about what we were talking about earlier, algorithmic amplification, right? So it may be that Alex Jones is on the platform but doesn't get any views, whereas this other person is on the platform but gets tons of views. That's Facebook's decision. But the danger of giving Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and the rest of them this power is that it's a lot of power for a small number of private citizens to exercise over public discourse, especially because those private citizens are not subject to any democratic oversight. So both of the obvious possibilities here, I think, come with real risks, and not just risks, but profound democratic risks, right? In either case, like if you went to either of these with either of these options, or at least to an extreme, you would undermine the democratic process, because you would give either the government or these private powerful actors the ability to decide the outer limits of public discourse that is necessary for democracy. So I think that the hard job for people who care about both tech policy and democracy is to come up with a set of policy interventions that avoid these really significant problems of the two options that are most often cited. One option is the government should do more to, the government should be empowered to suppress misinformation. The other one is, private platforms should be suppressing more misinformation. And I think there are options which I'm happy to talk about, but I am aware that all my answers keep going for 20 minutes.
Let's talk about those options, because that was going to be my next question. Like, where does this leave us, right? What are the feasible options here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the options that are most appealing to me are what some people call systemic options. So rather than have the government or private powerful actors intimately involved in deciding which speech gets heard or which ideas get traction, better to impose systemic solutions like privacy regulation, which would restrict what the platforms can collect and thereby limit the degree to which they can micro-target messages to small communities. And that kind of micro-targeting, this is its own conversation, but that kind of micro-targeting, I think, is a big factor in the spread of certain kinds of misinformation. So that's privacy. Another set of interventions would involve transparency mandates. So ensure that when the private these powerful private actors are intervening in or are shaping public discourse in the ways that we've just been discussing, that the public has some insight into the way that those platforms are shaping public discourse. And those transparency interventions could involve a combination of things: requiring the platforms to disclose certain information to the public, requiring them to disclose certain kinds of information to researchers, protecting researchers and journalists who study the platform. So right now, platforms sometimes use their terms of service as a means of shutting down journalistic or academic investigations that are inconvenient to the platforms. The terms of service really make the platforms gatekeepers to research about the platforms. And I think one thing that Congress could do here is provide some legal protections for the people who are trying to explain to the public how the platforms are shaping public discourse. Antitrust intervention, I think, is also hugely important. To the extent our concern is that, well, it's a very small number of private actors who are making these decisions about what can be said and who can say it. Antitrust intervention at least helps ensure that there's a diversity of decision makers and a diversity of platforms that users can choose from. I would say these are all. I mean, I'll give you one more: interoperability. So regulation that would allow third parties to build on the networks that these big social media companies have created. That too would ensure a kind of diversity, because other people could offer. One of the reasons we don't have that kind of diversity now is that network effects make it very hard for people to build competitors to Facebook and YouTube and even Twitter. Once you have established platforms, it's not that it's impossible to build a competitor, but it's very hard. If you had interoperability regulation, you would make it a little bit easier for people to build alternatives to these existing platforms. And the last one I'll mention is just digital public digital media. All the platforms I've mentioned so far are private ones, but just like we have public radio, we could have public digital media as well. So that's another possible intervention here.
That's interesting. I mean, these 5 points you mentioned, and I've proposed some of them myself, and they all, I mean, to me, make a lot of sense. The data, the privacy issue, and it reminds me of the approach India is taking around this thing called the data empowerment and protection architecture. It remains to be seen how well it actually plays out, but I can appreciate the thinking. I like the transparency mandate. I've sort of proposed that, financial services, heavily regulated, require transparency of all sorts. And that provides an interesting model for social media as well.
Yeah, that I mentioned these two cases out of Florida and Texas. So those laws both impose very significant transparency obligations on the platforms. And one of the questions that is raised in those cases is whether those transparency mandates are consistent with the First Amendment. And you just made this totally understandable analogy to the transparency mandates that are imposed in the financial institutions. But one argument that I think you have to grapple with is whether transparency mandates imposed on expressive actors pose special kinds of risks, right? So
by expressive actors, you mean what?
So imagine that Congress passed a law that said major newspapers, when they reject op-ed submissions, they need to explain publicly in a few sentences why they did it. I think that law would almost certainly be struck down as unconstitutional. And I hope it would be, because that kind of law, that kind of transparency obligation would impose, I think, a quite significant burden on the editorial decision making of the newspapers. The newspapers, if they had to explain every decision to accept or reject an op-ed, might make different decisions, right? They might decide, well, you know what, maybe we have to accept this one after all, because otherwise we're going to have to account to Congress for our decision to reject it, right? I would say that not only would it impose a burden on their editorial decision making, it would require them to totally change their editorial processes, because it's not like when the Wall Street Journal assesses a submitted op-ed, they are comparing the op-ed to a kind of checklist, right? They're not saying, there's no checklist that says, does this have the right number of words in every sentence? Does it reference the following things? Does it violate these laws? There's no checklist like this. This is a kind of almost like an artistic decision made by editors, right? Editors say, yeah, this seems like the kind of thing that we should be publishing. And for the same reason, I don't want to draw too close an equivalence here, because I don't think the Wall Street Journal is Michelangelo, but you can imagine a similar requirement being imposed on visual artists, right? Visual artists, you have to explain why you depicted this person and not that person, and it would be a huge burden on editorial decision making, understood broadly. So some people come to these social media laws and they say, well, why isn't this exactly the same as those laws you just described? These laws are requiring Twitter and Facebook to explain why they're making the content moderation decisions they are. And some of the people who've made this argument have, made a parallel between drawn a parallel between the social media companies and newspapers, saying that social media companies are just like newspapers, or they are sufficiently like newspapers that the First Amendment should apply to them in exactly the same way as it applies to newspapers. And if you believe that, it's very difficult to see how these transparency mandates can be constitutional, because these transparency mandates in the Florida and Texas laws are very significant ones. They would never be acceptable if imposed on traditional newspapers. And I would say that if you accept this idea that social media companies and newspapers have to be treated in exactly the same way under the First Amendment, it's hard to see how there are very few transparency mandates that would survive First Amendment scrutiny. Now, I don't actually believe this. I don't actually think that social media companies and newspapers are the same in this particular context. I think the differences between them are very significant. Social media companies are not intimately involved in editorial decision making in the same way as newspapers are. For the most part, when I tweet, I am assured that my draft tweet will then go up on the platform, and the platform, the decision making by the platform is really limited to mostly after the fact decision making about whether my tweet violated their terms of service, right? Like whether, or their community standards. Like if I tweet something that is, incitement to violence, it's probably going to get taken down. But within very broad parameters, whatever I write is going to be published. And that seems like a very significant difference to me. In fact, this what I'm telling you now, I actually wrote it up in an op-ed for the New York Times. And when I wrote it up for the New York Times, I did it with one of my colleagues at the Knight Institute, Scott Wilkins. And the two of us sent this thing in to the New York Times. And the New York Times wrote back and said, we like this piece, but we don't understand this. We think you need to explain this other thing more fully. We want you to consider this word rather than this word in this paragraph. And here's the headline we're thinking about going with. And we went back and forth with them, 4 or 5 times before we came to, which was, from my perspective, actually very useful, because they have good editors there and they improve your work. But the point is that they were intimately involved in the decision to not just to publish this piece, but they were intimately involved in what was published and deciding what was published, And that's a very different experience than once the piece was published, I tweeted about it, right? And when I tweeted about it, nobody from Twitter called me and said, listen, we think that your tweet is pretty good, but it probably needs a couple more words here, and this word you're using, inappropriately. Nobody called me from Twitter and said any of those things. So the editorial processes are totally different. And I think that the implications of transparency mandates are totally different. And there are circumstances in which a transparency mandate that would be intolerable with respect to traditional newspapers shouldn't be viewed as such when applied to social media companies. But that's the issue. That's a hugely significant issue, and that's one of the issues that's presented to the Supreme Court in these two cases out of Texas and Florida, which everybody, I think, expects the Supreme Court to consider next term.
Yeah, great points around transparency and how onerous it can be. There was another point you brought up, which is the antitrust intervention. I'm going to come back to that. I was also chuckling when you said, Twitter doesn't call you and say, hey, here's a way to improve your tweet, because I can just imagine, a year from now, ChatGPT will be integrated into it.
That's true.
And it'll say, hey, maybe you want to change this wording
Right.
if you want to get more attention. So, Jameel, I want to talk about TikTok, which is, has been front and center for some time now. It had the attention of the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, which is proposing to ban TikTok. So how should we think about this, in free speech terms, in national security terms, in terms of data privacy? How should we be thinking about this, and what's the right thing to do?
Well, so let me first say that I'm sympathetic to some of the arguments that the Biden administration and before that the Trump administration made with respect to TikTok. I think that they're absolutely right that TikTok collects a lot of information about its users. They're absolutely right that the algorithm, which is mainly invisible to the users, could in theory be used to spread or amplify disinformation. They're also right that TikTok is owned by a Chinese corporation, and China is an authoritarian country with a government that has abused its power over and over again in the past and continues to abuse its power today. So I agree with all of that. Where I part ways with both the Biden administration and the Trump administration is in when it comes to the question of what should be done about it. And the proposal that the Biden administration was making, I don't know if they're still, how forcefully they're pursuing this now, but the proposal was to ban TikTok. Tell Americans, there are almost 150 million Americans use TikTok now. Tell Americans that they can't use TikTok, that they can't access this platform anymore. And this makes me extremely uncomfortable, because there are governments all over the world right now that are invoking national security as a justification for restricting their own citizens' access to ideas and information from abroad. I think we should be very wary of giving our own government the power to restrict our access to information and ideas from abroad. Does that mean that never could a ban on a social media platform be justifiable in my view? No, I accept that there may be extreme circumstances in which the government should be permitted to ban Americans from accessing a foreign platform. But I think it's important that we make sure that when the government is doing this, it's a last resort and not a first resort. And here, if the concerns, so the two concerns that, have been raised most often, one is privacy and the other is disinformation. With respect to privacy, if you are really interested in protecting Americans' privacy, the best way to do that is to pass a privacy law that restricts not just TikTok from collecting this kind of information, but would restrict other companies from collecting it as well. And TikTok is no different from other social media platforms in this respect. Facebook collects as much information as TikTok does, and many other companies, not social media companies, collect information about Americans too, including information that is arguably much more sensitive, biometric information, all sorts of information about our financial.
But Jameel, just if I may, I mean, isn't there like a big difference between TikTok collecting data and Facebook collecting data, in the sense that we have control over Facebook in some sense, but we have absolutely no control over TikTok?
I think that's a fair point. But there are ways of addressing that too. So one would be to require data to be localized, right, to be held here in the United States rather than shipped to China. But even if you believe that the collection by Facebook of all this information doesn't present the same risks as the collection by TikTok, and even if you believe that localization isn't going to be enough, you have to ask the question: is a ban actually going to address the problem? And given how much information is available from data aggregators in the United States, like if China wants information about you and me, they don't need TikTok to get it. They can just go to American data aggregators and buy, huge data sets about
Well,
millions of Americans.
yeah, that's true. Except that it's not the same quality of information they're getting, right? I mean, I'd gone out last night with a bunch of my students. We were having a drink, and they asked me, and I was talking about, hitchhiking from Kabul to London in the 70s, and one of the students asked me, like, "Hey, Prof, like, if someone were to point a gun to your head and say you can either go back to the 70s or now, what would you choose?" And I said, I don't know, that would be a hard one to answer. Like, what do you think? And they said, well, I mean, there's no way. I mean, I spent 4 or 5 hours on TikTok. And I said, well, that is exactly the problem. Like, that there's people sort of addicted to TikTok, right? The algorithm has basically figured out how to give you sort of 5% interesting content. And then, the other 95% leaves you sort of wanting. Like, you just want that, additional content. And I know several people who are sort of on TikTok 4 or 5 hours a day, right? And they admit that, yeah, it's an addiction, right? That I just sort of want more. And, so I come back to this point you made earlier, which I thought was, right on target, which is that, we need a sort of systematic solution to this, right? It can't be bespoke and say, well, we just don't like TikTok, and so we're going to ban it. Like, I get that. And so, my question, I guess, comes back to, like, what will these systemic solutions look like, right? What is TikTok doing where one could make a case?
This is that complicated. I mean, if the concern is TikTok is collecting information, then restrict TikTok from collecting information. But I wouldn't stop at TikTok. I would apply that across the board. And this is not a new, I don't claim at all to be original here. This is a proposal that privacy advocates have been making for 20 years, right?
But you can't stop them, right? You can't stop a social media platform from collecting information. It's kind of, that's their business, right? They're in the business of collecting information, right? And then maximizing attention, right? That's their business.
I think law can shape business models. If there are certain business models that would be made off limits by privacy regulation, right? So, and this we're very unusual in the United States in that we don't have a general privacy regime, right? Almost maybe every other Western democracy has a general privacy law, comprehensive privacy law. We don't have one, and the result is that TikTok can collect a lot more information about Americans than it can about Canadians or Europeans. And that's a problem we should fix. And we should fix it not just with respect to TikTok, but with respect to the social media platform of tomorrow, which we, haven't even heard about today. And the way to do that is through a general privacy law. And with respect to, the other thing that the government can do is it can tell Americans, like if it believes that TikTok is being used for disinformation purposes, and I don't think there's there's research backing this up right now. Although I accept that one day, TikTok could be used in this way or hijacked in this way by the Chinese government. But if the the U.S. government believes that the Chinese Communist Party has hijacked TikTok's algorithm so that TikTok's algorithm is amplifying Chinese propaganda and suppressing videos about abuses by the Chinese government, then our government should tell us that. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of steps that our government should take before we accept a ban on a major social media platform. And I'm worried not just because, I think that TikTok is known maybe for dance videos, but it's used for all sorts of things, including sharing political ideas and sharing academic ideas. And I, don't think that we should accept, unthinkingly or unquestioningly the proposal that that our government has the power to shut something like this down on the basis of arguments that, in my view, don't really, hold water.
Yeah, no, all great points, Jameel. And one of my views on this is that this is sort of a battle for attention among platforms. And my very first guest, Arun Sundarajan, we talked about sort of platform wars. That the U.S. and China are actually at war, but it's a proxy war being waged through platforms, and it's a war for attention. And I think we ought to sort of look at that as a potential risk, right? I'm not saying that this is bad and we should shut it down, but to me, there's a deficit of attention. And it seems like this particular platform really, along with a few others, is monopolizing attention, right? And I think that's a potential risk that we should consider. But, I'm keeping track of the time, and I know you have to hop. And I'm a little bummed that we have to actually cut short this conversation at this time. So I'm just going to have you come back on and talk about a bunch of issues.
Maybe once the court decides these cases, I can come back and we can talk about them.
Yeah. That would be a good time to do that. But, we didn't talk about AI and all of those interesting things that seem to be appearing on the horizon. And I think, maybe potentially transformative in terms of crafting laws and how law is practiced. But we'll save that for another time. But thanks so much, Jameel. It's the time went by way too quickly, and like I said, I'm a little bit bummed. So we'll do this again.
We'll continue the conversation. But thank you. It's been great to talk with you.
Great. Thanks again. Take care.